The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Well, welcome back to The Divide. This is the final interview, the fourth interview that Drew and I are doing of one another. And this is the second time I get to interview Drew. So, hey, Drew.
How's it going?
And the question that I'm putting to you is the question you put to me last time, which is, so you have some positive view of the universe, positive meaning a definite view of the universe, of ultimate reality. And so what is that view, and what is the best evidence that supports your view?
All right. So before I give you the view, I'm going to admit that there's not a lot of evidence for the view, because basically the view is that we as humans get to sort of decide our purpose and figure out our purpose in this life, and as we go along, and we get to figure out how we interact with others, and if we're going to be, loving and kind, or if we're going to be selfish and cruel. And so the way we interact with the world is very individualistic, and it's very much based on our choices. And so dialing back to why I don't have much evidence for this, it's because
it's a religion, I guess. Then,
well, it is because I don't believe we have much evidence for anything. I think that's the whole point of skepticism is that I really do feel everything can be questioned. You and I have talked about how do we know that the universe wasn't created 5 minutes ago. Because maybe there was some you can argue about the intentions of this creator, but maybe some mad scientist, mad genius created this thing and put all these memories in our head, that kind of thing. Or then there's the brain in the vat kind of thing. It's like the Matrix. Is like, how can we prove that that's not the case? And the answer is we really can't prove any of these things. There's not a lot that we can prove, and there's not a lot that we can be certain of. And so how do I get from there to sort of my philosophy or my way of seeing the world? There's not a lot of straight line, other than when all of the other things are questioned. The only thing that makes sense to me is to sort of forge my own path and to sort of do things as they seem right to me, to quote from the Book of Judges.
and which, by the way, was not a favorable
at
the time. But so the rest of society is just supposed to be grateful you're not a psychopath.
That's a fair criticism, and I don't really sort of put this up as an evidenced way to go through life, other than to say that the evidence for my way of thinking is the lack of evidence for other ways of thinking. And you've talked about how, well, you have to have some way of living, and I think my understanding of my way, at least as much as I understand it, is that I just have to figure it out, one day at a time. I don't have, there's not a lot of unquestionables in my philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So let me give you an analogy of what it sounds like to me. So in the Indiana Jones movie, The Last Crusade, at the end of the movie, Indiana, his dad's been shot, right, and he has to get across the canyon. I know you know this movie, and he has to go across this canyon. I don't know if it's like 20 or 30 feet or something like that, and it drops hundreds and hundreds of feet. and his clue is something about taking a leap of faith. And so he closes his eyes, he steps out, and lo and behold, he steps out onto what seems like air, and yet it stops. And then the camera kind of pans down, and you see from the side view that he's actually stepped onto a rock bridge, like of some kind, and then he throws some sand out onto the bridge so you can see the whole thing across the canyon, and then he walks across over to the next into the cave across the way to get the cup or whatever of water that'll heal his dad. Sean Connery, I think it was. So, what's so great about that ending is that when they pan down and show you what actually he stepped on, it's like, oh, well, that all makes sense. You know, he's actually standing on something that really would support the weight of a human being. It's a kind of shale rock or something like that. And it's camouflage, which explains why he couldn't see it, all this. So it all sort of makes sense. And the way you're describing life or ultimate reality or our life, to me, is as if the movie ended with Indy just walking across air and there's no sense to it. There's nonsense, but somehow he's able to just do it. And that's it. So.
Well, I would push back and say that the movie might end in my case with him just dying on the other side, never able to cross, or falling into the precipice, or something like that. The skeptic thinks that the bridge may not actually be there. Now, obviously, we would both agree that if the bridge is there, then all it takes is being able to see it or to be able to know it's there. And but that's where we would divide, of course, on whether or not that bridge actually exists. And so, I kind of see the it's to me, it's not like a choice of are you going to believe in this, and it's something that is actually makes everything make sense, makes everything kind of come out like you want in the end. To me, there's no evidence, I guess, for that. And so I don't see that it's that's the situation we're in, I guess.
Well, so let me explain it just a little bit further then. That the way I see God is that we're already on the bridge, not that we're sort of deciding whether to go out there or not, but it's more like we're already standing on it. And the very fact that we're here demands a certain explanation. There's big scientific questions, big philosophical questions. A simple scientific one might be something like what explains the natural laws of the universe, not to mention just that the universe is here at all. And then there's philosophical ones and practical questions. And so to me, in order to make any sense out of our current reality, our current existence, God is the kind of thing that actually works as an explanation. Not that it's appropriate from my perspective to think of God as a kind of thing, but anyway, the attributes. And now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about Yahweh in the full sense of the biblical idea, or and not even trying to differentiate Yahweh from Allah or even some Hindu ideas of God or the Aristotelian idea of God. Just what they call classical theism, just that there's God who is eternally existent, who's one, who is good, who wills the universe to exist, things like that. So very basic attributes. And the sort of spectrum of attributes is defined by what's required for us to be supported in our metaphysical views, our scientific views, our moral views, and so on. It's just in order to make sense of any of those things that all of us have on a daily basis as part of our reality, we perceive to be real, mathematics, logic, all these kind of things that are part of our reality. They just simply are nonsense without God and these specific set of attributes. In other words, it's not just God as a kind of magical pill that's generic and we just take take God like a panacea that just explains every mystery, but rather a specific set of attributes that are required to make sense out of anything. Like, for example, in my analogy, it was the shale. That type of rock works as the kind of thing you could use for a bridge. So speak to that.
No, that's interesting, because I have often agreed with you that a creator is the kind of thing that would explain a universe like the one we live in. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is a creator, and it certainly doesn't mean that creator is, the Christian conception of God, or that it's the Christian God himself. And I think the part of what you said that I would most push back on is, in my concept, this creator is not necessarily even good. I think a lot of philosophers would argue over whether creation, it's good that that creation has happened. I tend to think it is, but I'm not a philosopher. But I guess we could. It might be interesting, since I'm not going to offer much more in the way of evidence. It might be interesting to discuss these concepts that you have of these attributes that would be inherent to God, because just the idea of God being good and benevolent doesn't necessarily follow from a God who creates and then a universe exists. So how does that get in there?
Oh, I actually agree with that. Meaning, I wouldn't have defined goodness as benevolence in that sense. But good in a more. I think benevolence is a type of goodness, but I didn't mean it in that specific way. I meant it more in the sense of good, or like, for example, we perceive order as a kind of inherent goodness,
like we talked about last time.
Right.
The good and the sort of the true, orderly, non-chaotic, non-false, sensical versus the nonsensical.
Yeah. It's not that we don't allow for some chaos or randomness as being part of what could be an overall good system, but nonetheless, I'm not quite speaking of like altruism or that.
Well, we may not have
Christian ideas
as much to argue about as I.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question then.
Okay.
Unless you want to keep going.
No. I was just going to say that I do. I think there is some difference in the way you see sort of the order. You see a purpose in the order, and I don't necessarily see that purpose. We talked about that a little bit last time. I gave my temperature analogy of, like, if paper burned at a certain degree Fahrenheit or degree Celsius, then that doesn't necessarily mean there's a purpose to that. And then you actually kind of push back on that. But anyway, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I use the word directedness, which is, that's my apologies here to our listeners, but this is my classical background using the Greek concept of telos, which is an Aristotelian concept. By the way, I saw Drew and I are doing this interview in the midst of what seems to be a near collapse of American society in 2020. And I saw indeed an article about Aristotle and how he needs to be canceled.
Oh, wow.
So even Aristotle, even my reference to Aristotle is now controversial.
Well, if anybody's playing the Divide drinking game, there's your mention of Aristotle for this episode. But anyway, before the order.
Well, let me ask you,
stuff.
Before we get to some of that other stuff, let me ask you, would you think this is very persuasive to other people?
I don't really even find it persuasive myself. I mean, the positive way to view the world, or the not just sort of doubting everything, but coming up with a worldview, to me is entirely personal. Like, I don't understand how I could fathom what would go into somebody else's idea of that. I mean, certainly there are some things that I think we should all agree on, like life is better than death, and being kind is better than murdering someone. But I mean, those are sort of the social contract, those are sort of things that we all figure out as a society and as human beings. And I've kind of said in the past, I don't know if it makes sense to everybody, but to me it makes sense that if there were no other humans, if I was the only human, then there would be a a great limit, a very different picture of what is right and what is wrong, because there would be no one to do wrong to in certain ways. So there would be a limited idea of right and wrong. But anyway, that, all that's very sort of head in the clouds to me. I mean, the reason I'm not more dogmatic about this is because I really just feel that the skepticism limits the sort of the
Insanity.
really
dumb conclusions.
It just basically and really, to the extent that it can limit any conclusions, that's why this very unconvincing personal type of worldview has to be sort of created.
Mm-hmm. So one of my sort of general views is that skepticism isn't a sufficient basis, to build a worldview off of it, and that eventually you just sort of get marginalized into a corner where there's nothing really to engage in other than just a sort of this what you call common sense. But for me, common sense only works because we have, again, there has to be some bridge underneath it to make it commonly reliable and so on.
Well, obviously, to some extent, I agree with that. That's why I'm kind of conceding here that this is all very, there has to be a personal thrust. There's no,
mm-hmm.
there's no absolute worldview, so to speak, that I would even put forward. However, skepticism, inclines me to think that there's not for you either. Like, it's not just, this is a limitation because of my skepticism. This is a limitation that I feel we all have, and that theists just don't really want to believe that
mm-hmm.
that's the truth. But like, if you think about morality, for instance, and you think, well, we have to have an absolute, we have to have a lawgiver, I guess, is the way I've heard it. But we have to have, and even if we've talked about Euthyphro and that the whole dilemma about does God make things good or does God say what's good, and then you have this idea of, well, God is good.
Euthyphro, take another drink.
Exactly. So, but the thing to me is, I think that when Christians sort of decide what's right and what's wrong, they don't have a direct line to any kind of law coming down from God. And the Bible is certainly open for interpretation in a lot of ways. I think to some extent you would agree that it has to be.
You literally had a scene where the law came down from God, right?
But you would agree, right, that the Bible has to be interpreted. And
sure. It's only a few laws. Is your point? Is there's only a few big ones there that are spelled out, and even those have to be interpreted.
I guess my point is that it really doesn't help matters to say that there's a lawgiver and that God is truth and God is love and right, and all of these things come down from that. It doesn't really change the fact to me that we really can't know what is right and what is wrong, just because we have this concept that all of these things come from God.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you were saying that in the general idea of God, the traditional idea of God, not a God of one particular religion, then I would say I half agree with you that there's not much spelled out if you're just sort of believing in the God of the philosophers or whatever. But I mean, the average God, however you want to call it, just not Zeus or Jupiter or something like that, but the eternal one God creator, then I would think it still has some practical thing, because the reality of such a being would certainly mean you would be naturally inclined to talk to them. You'd be inclined to do, I think, certain things that you might feel like, I don't quite know how to explain why it feels right to take care of the ecosystem I live in, the environment I live in, but it just seems like it goes hand in hand with his idea that we're here and God willed us to be here. That's one of his basic attributes. And so, we should take that pretty seriously, even if it's not spelled out exactly how to do that. It would seem like that's a much firmer ground to rest upon rather than just having nothing.
Well, from my perspective, the things that I think the first thing I would say is I think for the most part, you and I are probably going to agree on what's right and what's wrong. I mean, there's certainly going to be some error bars in there on the fringes, but we're both going to agree about most things. And so are, other religions, so are other societies and cultures. I mean, there are going to be some that disagree, but by and large, there's a lot of agreement about morality. And so it seems unreasonable to me to think that it comes from not only from a creator, but from, a specific, idea of that creator, like the Christian view, or any other view, because it seems like we all kind of come down on the same ideas.
I mean, you and I are going to come down probably mostly, right? Because we have some American Judeo-Christian culture in which we were raised. Caesar, I don't think shed many tears over the carnage he wreaked. He when he raged against Gaul, ancient Gaul. It certainly would have been a very different moral framework than in some pretty crucial ways that differentiate you and me from him, I would think. Even though,
well, and we can,
even though, yes, there were a lot of common things too that we would share with Caesar.
And I would liken the things that Caesar did probably to some of the things that God did in the Old Testament, and say that it seems that there is an element. So maybe I was a little, speaking of turn, to say that the type of morality you and I would agree on would run, between all different cultures. Maybe that's not true. I don't know. Maybe that shows my ignorance of other cultures. But I do think that when we are deciding what is moral, like on a personal level, we don't necessarily, even if you're a devout Christian, I don't think you have that doesn't help you come up with deciding what is right and wrong.
So one of the things I think is confusing for us in our discussions, and it's got to be for listeners too, and I is that in one sense, I'm really trying at times to just stay with the idea of, like my bridge analogy was just whether there's any God, whether God, not any God among many, but rather whether God exists. And then there's this other layer, which is a separate, it's related, but it's a separate kind of argument, which is the biblical God. I'm a Christian, so I don't have any problem with us discussing that, but going back and forth, don't you think, Drew, that sometimes it's hard to have this discussion without moving back and forth?
Yeah, I know what you mean. In this case, though, I would have to say that whether you take the creator God in a general sense, or whether you take not only the Christian God, but any conception of God, I don't think that really truly helps your morality or your deciding between, is this right or is this wrong? I think, when an individual makes those decisions, thinks about, is this right or is this wrong? They may think about their conception of God and what that God would want from them. But I don't think it really, I don't think that's an objective standard that I think they're still bringing to bear the same kind of decision making that a skeptic or a non-Christian or even an atheist would think about. And I think, is this right or is this wrong is not necessarily black and white for anyone.
Yeah. So I think maybe I didn't make this clear enough. I really agree with you about this point. I said I half agree, I guess, because I tried to say there actually were a couple of things that I think would change a person's practical outlook, even just believing in God without any sort of sacred text to tell you what they think. I do totally agree that that the revelation of God's ideas is where you would add a whole lot more clarity. Would even that settle everything? No, you would still need tons of interpretation about what God meant and how that applies in innumerable circumstances in life. There's no way, unless the books are literally written at each moment to deal with every moral conundrum. You're going to need revelation and then interpretation and application. That's just true of everything. Our Constitution is similar to that idea. So I think I'm in agreement with you. I don't think it wasn't really my initial point. My initial point wasn't to try and say we need God so that we have clarity in practical terms about exactly what to do in every situation. In other words, to tell us what is right or what is wrong, but we need God to justify that there's anything right or wrong, that to have the category of rightness and wrongness at all as part of our experience, unless it's just going to be utterly arbitrary based on the period we live in and the instincts we have, or the family we lived in, or any number of highly contingent factors, which I know you don't. I don't think you think that. So my thought was to have any sort of real morality, muscular morality, transcendent morality. For that to work, you have to have something like the bridge, something. I say something like God. I just don't know what else it would be. But we can just call it eternal being with these other attributes, but it was just the word God.
So that's kind of what I was trying to push back against, is that because you believe there's a God, you believe there's an absolute standard, and I don't know that's. I mean, that's in theoretically that makes sense, but that doesn't. I don't see how that. It just seems kind of like the God of the gap sort of thing. It's like, well, yeah. We all believe that there's a right and there's a wrong, and why do we believe that? Well, there must be a God that's giving us the standard, or is the standard. Otherwise, things couldn't be absolutely right or absolutely wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's true to say that if you want there to be absolute right and wrong, then you have to have something absolute. So, yes, I would not agree with you in that sense, that I do think you have to have something absolute. Otherwise, the category is meaningless. That's my point, is that it all becomes nonsense. In other words, what it feels like to me, what I think it feels like to the theist, is that the non-believer wants to sort of smuggle in God, or maybe wants to borrow these ideas and use the same language and live every day as if we can kind of just say, yeah, we all know this is right or wrong, without ever having to explain the grounds for that. And if there's no grounds, if there's no bridge, then it should imply at a sort of logical level, it should imply then that must mean there's no ultimate or absolute right or wrong, good or evil. And so it would seem like your position should be, yeah, there is none. But I think that experientially, it's, if I understand you, sort of commonsensically or experientially, it just, you've said, it just seems like it'll always be wrong, to kill a child or whatever, 100,000 years from now. Different universe, doesn't really matter. 2 + 2 = 4 in a moral sense.
Yeah, I believe that. I don't know that I would be able to say that I believe that is an absolute. I mean, I would say that I absolutely believe that it's not. It doesn't have anything to do with culture or age or anything like that. It'll be wrong 100 million years from now. What I would say is that I think that it kind of goes back to my thing about. This follows from the fact that there are more than one of us, that we live in this thing, and it, to me, it goes back to the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there's a lot of, I mean, it's not about an absolute for me. It's about that is a that is a logical truism that works. And that, if we want good, if we want flourishing, if we want a happy world, if we want happy people, then there are certain things we'll do and certain things we won't do. And so is murder, absolutely wrong? Is there some kind of standard out there that is written in the sky or on the fabric of the universe or on our chromosomes or something? I don't know. I'm skeptical about that. I mean, maybe there is a creator. Maybe there are these standards, but it could also just be that's like math, right? That's what works. We don't have a reason why 2 + 2 = 4. We just know that every time we sum it, that's what we come up with. And so when you want to have good in the world, you don't murder. You are loving. These are just sort of truisms. I mean, they just are because they work.
Let me say that for people listening, because Drew knows this, but I think, Drew, I can point this out as a real problem I think Christians have when they're having these conversations. If I may just criticize my own side here, practitioners, is that often Christians leave the impression that non-believers are somehow inherently or in principle less moral people in terms of their sort of or as though they can't practice morality because they reject God. I don't think that's really true. I mean, I agree with Drew here that and actually it's not even biblical, just to be clear. The Bible asserts pretty clearly right from the very beginning, people are moral. All people are moral. So all people are capable of morally good choices, morally bad choices. So I believe the Christian story that people are fallen, but I still think we're all capable of moral goodness and badness, and will do badness as well as will do good things too. But I don't think it's really. I think it's a mistake sometimes, and because I hear just a little bit when I'm hearing Drew, I hear sometimes how I've talked to other atheists who think that I'm trying to say, oh, that person, because they don't believe in God, they are sort of already dangerous to society morally immediately by the sheer fact that they don't believe in God. Well, that's just not true. I don't think that's true at all. People can be dangerous to society whether they're religious or not, as it's been shown many, many times over and again. But Drew, to your point about 2 + 2 = 4 just works, that's exactly my argument. We're just back to, I suppose, no surprise, but we're back to square one, is that when it comes to the category of morality, when it comes to mathematics, another great, amazing feature of our universe, logic, the area of logic, another amazing feature of our universe, the natural laws, I could go on and on, that when it comes to these big features of the universe that work, I agree, but they work in the same way Indiana Jones's bridge works. They work because there's something really there that has certain properties that are required to be there in order for those things to work as we assume they work. And I suppose we're just coming here to the divide, which is I'm expressing a confidence that layer of being, which I'm going to call God, has to be there in order for all this to work and to make sense. Otherwise, it makes nonsense. And you're saying, you go ahead, you can fill in the blank so I don't say it for you, but you're going to say,
well, I'm going to say that these are just brute facts of the universe, that they are, doesn't necessarily mean they're tied together by a creator God in any kind of cosmic way, but just that these are things that we can discover about the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there are things that don't raise the questions that I think God answers, or that God, if I understand you, you say that these things do seem to, like, we do have further questions about things like morality. Like it's totally sensible to ask the question, why does morality seem to be this objective reality in the universe, and it's not just in our heads, and it's part of something bigger and deeper and so on. But that you just don't feel compelled to the conclusion that God, if I understand you, you say that God would work as an answer, but because brute fact really doesn't work as an explanation to me. That's not to say it's not true. It could be true. I would just say it would all be then nonsense. Like there's no sense to it. There's no explanation to it. It's just there. Whereas I think of God as an explanation.
I would probably take it one by one, and I would say, some things do, just the fact that we're all here, the fact that there's a universe to begin with, that begs a question. How did we get here? Why does 2 + 2 equal 4? To me, doesn't beg the question of anything. It's just the way things work in the world that we live in. I don't think to ask why does 2 + 2 equal 4, or why is killing someone for no reason wrong, or there are a lot of things that don't, to me, beg the question. There are probably other things besides why are we here that do, but that's the one that comes to mind. So I would say yes and no. I mean, yes to that one, no to the others.
Okay, so let me try one time to explain. I don't know if I've ever tried this. I'm going to try one time to explain. And keep in mind, when I'm trying to explain this to Drew, I'm half trying to explain this to myself. I think that's probably true of a lot of our conversations.
That's most of our conversations on both sides, believe me.
So here, and I'm not going to mention where this thing called the law of non-contradiction comes from, because I don't want people to keep drinking. I mean, a drink here and there is fine. But there's this thing called the law of non-contradiction. All that you need to know is it's a point of logic. Okay. But at the same time, though it's considered an elementary principle of logic in the field of logic, it is also something that applies to reality. Not in other words, it's not just a principle of logic. It's something that is inextricably related to reality itself. And the principle is that A cannot be A and non-A at the same time and in the same way. All right, so forget all that what I just said now, and let me just explain it to you. It means that the glass out of which you're drinking cannot at the same time be the leg of a camel and a glass. Like there's a logic to reality itself. The two there's not just logic over here on one side and then sort of metaphysical reality on the other, but the two are related. So that would be where I would try, and where my pushback, Drew, would be that I'm not just talking about logic as just sort of some, thing people do in the ivory towers of academics, but everybody's super practical, everyday logical decisions are embedded into reality. There's a bridge that pulls the two together, a chain link rather, that pulls the two together, and you can't separate them. And that's why, for me, the idea of logic as a principle is tied into the reality itself. It's tied into the very question about the universe being here or not being here, or why it is the way it is and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm not really trying to convince you of it. I was just trying to explain how I would see logic as just not something out there like they do in academics, but is part of just the basics of reality. Anyway, it was probably time to wrap up. I think that if you see a flaw in that, go ahead and interrupt before I close. But it's just my attempt to try and explain how I see them. Maybe we'll flesh it out at some point in the future. But I think that the divide here is pretty predictable. And just for people that understand, Drew and I, after these 4, this is probably the most, I wouldn't say it's the most we've ever talked like in detail about our differences of opinion about all sorts of things, as we've known each other for many years. But just to remind people, Drew and I are really good friends and get along very, very well. And our families get along well. And I think that both of us have been hugely profited. I have been benefited immensely by having to work through these kinds of conversations and constantly feel like I'm getting more humbled. I think that's the right word for it, in what I think the way I see things, and how is what I see, how does that fit in with the way you see things? And would you agree with that, or has this been a total disaster?
No divide there. Obviously I value your friendship, and I'm glad we can have these conversations. And for years, there's been multiple times when we've had a long talk, and then I've gone home thinking, what do I even think about this anymore? So it's definitely a working out of sort of how we see things over a long period of time. And I'm really glad we have been able to do that so far, and yet stay friends, and maybe even respect each other all the more for our sort of ability to have these conversations with an open mind.
Yeah, without animus,
Not only without animus, but with truly an open mind. I mean, I would pay you this compliment in that I think that it's not easy, especially when you have a dogma of some kind, to truly be open-minded about it and not just trying to push your point of view. A little easier when you don't have a dogma, so to speak. I mean, I'm sure you could probably argue against that, but for sure, it's just nice to be able to explore things like this with you. So I hope that everybody can hear in us, that we really have profited from that
we hope
willingness.
Yeah, and we hope people are able to do that with their friends, and it not always be tension. And
you don't always have to win the argument,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I also would say we really have enjoyed people who've contributed to the on Reddit to the TheDividebyiPUB. So please make sure you give your thoughts on our podcast, or questions you have, or disagreements you have with either of us, because we've really also benefited from extending the discussions on our subreddit.
Do you want to give the web address?
It's the divide. It's the divide at iPub.
Okay.
Is the
Reddit.
subreddit.
Okay.
Yeah, you just go to Reddit and type
reddit.com/TheDividebyiPUB, something like that.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, always a joy, Drew. Look forward to some more podcasts, many more podcasts to come, and excited about some ones that we've done recently that we're about to release. And so this is Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hallbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.